Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your weekly deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Rick Spair, and joining me as always is Laura.
Hey, Rick. Great to be back in the studio with you on this Sunday. And I have to say, today's topic is one of the most politically loaded stories we've tackled in weeks.
It really is. And for listeners just tuning in, what we're unpacking today is a report that Google is now in active talks with the United States Pentagon to deploy its Gemini models inside classified defense environments.
The reporting first broke through the information around April 16th of 2026, and it has set off a genuine three-way scramble among the frontier labs for military and intelligence contracts.
Let's set the scene properly, because this isn't just another enterprise deal, Laura. This is Google walking back into the same territory that nearly tore the company apart during the Project Maven controversy 8 years ago.
Exactly right. And the Project Maven echo is enormous here because back in 2018, Google employees staged a revolt, signed open letters, and the company eventually walked away from Pentagon computer vision work entirely.
And now, less than a decade later, Alphabet leadership appears to have decided that sitting out the defense AI market is simply not a viable commercial strategy, given how much federal money is flowing into classified AI procurement.
The numbers make the decision almost inevitable. The Department of Defense has been accelerating frontier AI procurement across all classification levels, and analysts estimate the total addressable market for classified AI in the tens of billions annually.
Walk our listeners through what Google is specifically offering in these negotiations, because I think the proposed contract language is really the most interesting part of the entire story from a governance perspective.
Google has reportedly proposed contractual safeguards that would prohibit two specific use cases, and those are domestic mass surveillance applications and the deployment of autonomous weapons without what they call meaningful human control.
That phrase, meaningful human control, is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, because it is a term of art in international humanitarian law circles, and it has no single agreed definition.
It really doesn't, and that ambiguity is probably a feature rather than a bug for Google's lawyers, because it lets them claim principled restraint while preserving enormous operational flexibility for the Pentagon side of the partnership.
Let's zoom out and talk about the competitive landscape, because Google is not walking into an empty market here. OpenAI already locked in a major Pentagon deal back in February of this year.
OpenAI's deal is what the Pentagon internally calls an all lawful purposes agreement, signed in February of 2026, and it covers deployment of OpenAI models across classified operations with some cloud system restrictions.
That deal, when it was announced, triggered a pretty significant user backlash. We saw thousands of ChatGPT subscribers cancel their accounts and uninstall the consumer app in protest of the military integration.
The consumer backlash was real, but honestly modest in commercial terms, because OpenAI simultaneously added something like 80 million new users during the same quarter. So the revenue math worked out fine for them overall.
That tells me something important about where we are culturally, Laura, which is that the broad public has largely made peace with defense AI in a way that would have seemed unimaginable 5 years ago.
I agree. And the third piece of the competitive puzzle is Anthropic, whose situation is probably the most dramatic of the three and, frankly, the most instructive for anyone thinking about AI safety trade-offs.
Let's dig into the Anthropic situation, because I think a lot of our listeners may not realize just how far the relationship between Anthropic and the Department of Defense has deteriorated in the last several weeks.
Anthropic refused to loosen certain safeguards that the Pentagon wanted relaxed, and in response, the department has reportedly labeled the company a supply chain risk, which is a serious procurement designation.
Supply chain risk label is not just a slap on the wrist. It can effectively block the company from a wide range of federal contracts, not only defense contracts, but civilian agency business as well.
Exactly. And the most aggressive development is that Anthropic has reportedly filed legal action against the Pentagon, alleging that the supply chain risk designation constitutes unlawful retaliation for the company's principled safety stance.
So we now have an active lawsuit between a frontier AI lab and the United States military, which I think is a genuinely unprecedented situation and tells you how high the stakes have gotten in this space.
It is unprecedented, and it creates a fascinating fork in the road for the industry. You can either accept looser use case restrictions in exchange for federal revenue, or you can hold the line and pay a real commercial price.
Google, reading that landscape, has clearly calculated that a middle path is possible where they negotiate specific written carve-outs rather than taking Anthropic's all-or-nothing stance on safeguards before entering the conversation.
The middle path calculation is sensible on paper, but history suggests these contract carve-outs tend to erode quickly once a model is operational inside classified networks, because enforcement is nearly impossible from the outside.
That's a really important point, and it connects to something our listeners should understand about classified deployment environments. Once a model is behind the secure fabric, external auditing by the vendor is extraordinarily limited.
Right? Google cannot send a trust and safety engineer into a secret compartmented information facility to review how Gemini is being prompted by an intelligence analyst, so the safeguards essentially have to be self-enforcing at the model level.
Which means the real safeguards in this deal are probably not the contract language, but the model weights themselves, meaning what Google trains Gemini to refuse to do, regardless of who is asking or why.
That's the crux of it, and it also means these negotiations are really about how much of Gemini's refusal behavior Google is willing to soften for a government tenant in exchange for the contract revenue.
Let's talk about the specific use cases the Pentagon seems to be most interested in, because I think that grounds the conversation in concrete operational reality rather than abstract ethical debate for a moment.
The reporting mentions 4 main categories, and those are intelligence data analysis, document triage across classified holdings, operational planning support, and logistics optimization across global supply chains and basing infrastructure.
None of those individually sound like the scary sci-fi use cases that dominate public debate, but in aggregate, they represent a massive acceleration of military decision speed, and that has its own real strategic implications.
The decision speed dimension is underappreciated in the public conversation. When a commander can synthesize a terabyte of intercepts in 90 seconds instead of 90 hours, the operational tempo of modern conflict changes in fundamental ways.
And that speed advantage is precisely why the Pentagon cannot afford to sit out frontier AI adoption, because every peer competitor, including China and Russia, is racing toward the same synthetic intelligence layer in their own command structures.
The Chinese military has been extremely public about their AI integration roadmap, and their state-backed labs don't need to negotiate safeguard contract language with their civilian leadership before deploying into operational environments.
Which creates a classic race-to-the-bottom dynamic where every Western safeguard that slows deployment is framed as a strategic liability rather than a principled commitment to human oversight of lethal decision-making.
That framing is the rhetorical engine behind the entire defense AI build-out. And it is very hard to argue against inside a Pentagon budget cycle, even when the empirical evidence for the race framing is thin.
Let me play a bit of devil's advocate here, Laura, because I think there's a reasonable argument that having Google and OpenAI inside the tent is actually better than ceding the field entirely to less scrupulous vendors.
That argument is legitimate, and I'd add that the frontier labs do bring real safety expertise that legacy defense contractors simply don't have. So their presence probably raises the floor on how responsibly these systems get deployed.
The counterpoint, though, is that once Google normalizes classified deployment, the political cost of holding a stricter line drops dramatically for every other vendor, and the whole industry's safety posture ratchets looser over time.
That ratchet effect is what the Anthropic team has been warning about internally for months. And it's probably why they chose to take the reputational and commercial hit rather than sign a deal they felt would set a bad precedent.
Let's talk about the internal dynamics at Google, because I suspect there are significant parts of the Gemini team who are not thrilled that leadership has taken the company back into territory that caused so much pain in 2018.
Google's workforce has changed substantially since the Project Maven days, with a lot of the original activist employees long gone. But there is still a meaningful cohort of engineers who consider defense work a red line.
Alphabet leadership will almost certainly face internal protests, open letters, and potentially resignations once this deal moves from rumor to confirmed contract, and that internal cost needs to be weighed against the external revenue.
Sundar Pichai has been notably quieter on AI ethics commitments over the last 2 years compared to the 2019 era. And this deal is consistent with a leadership posture that prioritizes commercial aggression over principled restraint.
Speaking of principled positions, let's come back to Anthropic for a moment, because I think their lawsuit against the Pentagon deserves more attention than it has gotten in the mainstream tech press so far.
The legal theory Anthropic is pursuing is essentially that the supply chain risk designation is pretextual and functions as retaliation for constitutionally protected commercial speech, specifically their published position on autonomous weapons and mass surveillance.
If that legal theory succeeds in court, it would create important precedent limiting the Pentagon's ability to weaponize procurement designations against vendors who publish principled positions on how their technology should be used.
And if it fails, which honestly seems more likely given the deferential posture courts take toward national security procurement, it will be seen as proof that principled AI safety commitments are commercially suicidal at scale.
It's a pretty grim binary outcome because either way, the case probably reshapes how every other AI lab writes their acceptable use policies and negotiates government contracts for at least the next 5 years.
The ripple effects will extend well beyond defense because once the Pentagon establishes that it can label labs as supply chain risks for principled holdouts, other federal agencies will absolutely adopt the same procurement lever for their own purposes.
So what should our listeners watch for over the next few weeks as this Google Pentagon story develops toward an actual announced contract versus remaining in the negotiation phase we're seeing today?
3 signals matter most. First, watch for a confirmed dollar figure because the size will tell us how much of the OpenAI playbook Google is adopting versus charting its own more limited path.
Second signal would be Google's internal communications, specifically whether leadership publishes any updated AI principles document that walks back or reframes the 2018 commitments on weapons and surveillance applications.
Exactly. And the third signal to watch is whether the Anthropic lawsuit advances past a motion to dismiss, because that procedural milestone will set the tone for how seriously courts treat the retaliation theory going forward.
I'd add a fourth signal, which is whether any other major AI lab, particularly Meta or a leading Chinese exposed player, follows Google's specific contract language approach, or instead takes the OpenAI style all lawful purposes posture.
That's a great addition, and honestly, the shape of the Meta position will tell us a lot because they have their own new Muse Spark model to productize, and defense revenue would accelerate that commercialization timeline considerably.
Before we wrap, Laura, give our listeners one concrete takeaway they should hold in their heads about this entire defense AI contracting moment and what it means for the broader ecosystem over the next year.
Here's my takeaway. The era of frontier AI labs being able to remain above the fray on defense applications is effectively over, and every major lab will need a clear, documented, and publicly defensible position on classified deployment.
That's well said. And mine is that the real regulatory action on AI governance is no longer happening in Congress or Brussels. It's happening in Pentagon procurement offices and in the fine print of classified contracts.
And those procurement officers are setting precedents right now that will shape how every other agency and eventually every other government buys frontier AI for the foreseeable future, which is a quietly enormous policy shift.
One last question before we close, Laura, which is whether you think the allied governments in Europe and the Indo-Pacific will follow the American procurement model or carve out something more restrictive on defense applications.
My bet is that the United Kingdom and Australia follow the American model almost exactly. The French and Germans negotiate tighter carve-outs on autonomous systems, and Japan tries to thread the needle with its own domestic national champion vendor.
That fragmentation is going to make life very complicated for Google and OpenAI because they will need to maintain different model behavior profiles for different national security customers. And that adds enormous operational complexity at scale.
It also creates an opening for a new category of vendor, essentially a classified AI integrator that sits between the frontier labs and the sovereign defense buyer and manages all the safeguard customization as a service offering.
That's a fascinating prediction, and one our listeners should absolutely keep an eye on over the next 12 to 18 months, because that kind of specialist integrator could be the next big venture category in defense technology.
Agreed. And on that forward-looking note, Rick, I think we've given our audience a pretty rich map of where the defense AI contracting race stands today and the specific signals they should watch for next.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.